Hi guys, the night air over the Nile River was still warm long after the sun had disappeared beyond the dark western desert. Far away, beyond the quiet fields and sleeping villages, the sand held the heat of the day like a slow-burning fire beneath the moonlight. Palm leaves moved gently in the soft wind. Somewhere near the riverbank, water touched reeds with a faint and sleepy sound. Inside a small mud brick home, a clay oil lamp flickered beside a low wall. The room smelled faintly of smoke, warm bread, and woven straw mats that had rested there for many years. A family slept close together beneath thin linen sheets. Outside, sandals lay abandoned near the doorway, dusty from the long walk through the fields earlier that evening. The village had grown quiet hours ago. Only the dogs still wandered. Only the insects still sang. And above everything, the stars watched silently over ancient Egypt, just as they always had. For many thousands of years, life beside the Nile changed very slowly. So slowly, in fact, that one farmer might have recognized the daily routine of another farmer who lived centuries later. The same river flowed north. The same hot winds crossed the same dry hills. The same mud bricks dried beneath the same burning sun. In other places around the ancient world, kingdoms rose quickly and disappeared quickly. New customs arrived. Cities changed shape. Armies moved across borders. But Egypt often moved at another pace entirely. Quietly. Carefully. Like the river itself. Most people living in ancient Egypt did not expect life to become different. A father taught his son the same farming methods he had learned as a child. Scribes copied symbols exactly as older scribes had done before them. Bakers shaped bread in familiar ways. Fishermen pushed wooden boats into the water before sunrise just as their grandfathers once had. And in many ways, the people preferred it that way. Change could feel dangerous. Familiar routines felt safe. The Nile itself encouraged this feeling. Every year the river flooded its banks. Every year the dark soil returned. Every year farmers planted crops in nearly the same rhythm. The river created a world that repeated itself over and over again with comforting regularity. In the pale blue hours before dawn, the villages slowly awakened. A rooster cried somewhere near the edge of a field. Workers stirred beneath blankets. Sleepy children rubbed dust from their eyes while mothers rekindled cooking fires from yesterday's ashes. The smell of grain and smoke drifted into the cool morning air. Men wrapped linen around their waists and stepped into worn sandals. Women carried clay jars toward the riverbank to gather water before the heat grew stronger. Somewhere nearby, a donkey brayed impatiently while tied beside a low wall. The eastern horizon slowly brightened. And another ordinary day began almost exactly like the day before it. For the people of ancient Egypt, routine shaped nearly every hour of life. Most families did not travel far from where they were born. Some villagers may never have seen the Great Pyramids at all, even though those monuments stood proudly beneath the desert sun for generations beyond counting. A farmer's world was usually small. A few fields. A narrow path. A cluster of homes. The river. The local temple. That was enough. And because life stayed close to home, traditions survived easily. New ideas moved slowly along dusty roads and crowded riverboats. Some villages remained almost untouched by distant political events. Even when kings changed, ordinary work continued. Bread still needed baking. Fishing nets still needed repair. Children still chased each other through narrow alleyways while old men rested beneath patches of shade beside mud walls. In the early morning light, farmers walked toward the fields carrying wooden tools across their shoulders. The ground beneath their feet was cool for only a short time before the desert heat returned. They moved quietly, still heavy with sleep. Along the Nile, small boats drifted through gentle mist. Fishermen untangled nets while watching the pale sky reflect on calm water. Some chewed pieces of flat bread while they worked. Others sat silently, listening to birds calling from the reeds. The river smelled of mud, fish, wet plants, and life itself. Everything depended on it. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been almost entirely desert. Endless dry land stretched beyond a narrow green ribbon of fertile soil. The contrast was sharp. Green fields ended suddenly where golden sand began. This powerful landscape shaped the Egyptian mind from childhood onward. The river gave life. The desert waited silently nearby. And because the Nile behaved in fairly predictable ways most years, Egyptian society grew attached to order and repetition. Stability became deeply respected. The people admired balance in the same way they admired the steady return of sunrise after darkness. Even their religious beliefs reflected this feeling. The gods themselves protected order against chaos. Daily rituals mattered deeply because repetition seemed to keep the world safe and steady. Priests woke before dawn to wash temple floors, light incense, and offer food to divine statues. These actions repeated day after day, year after year. Inside the cool darkness of temples, priests moved carefully beneath painted ceilings covered with stars. The stone floors felt cold against bare feet before sunrise. Oil lamps cast long shadows across carved walls. The scent of incense drifted upward while distant city sounds slowly awakened outside. The rituals changed very little across generations. Young priests learned each movement exactly. Each spoken prayer mattered. Each gesture carried meaning. And outside the temple walls, ordinary people lived according to rhythms that also remained steady across time. Women ground grain using heavy stones that wore down slowly after years of use. The sound echoed through courtyards every morning. Bakers shaped dough by hand and pressed loaves into clay ovens blackened by smoke. Linen workers sat together twisting fibers into thread while children played nearby in the dust. The work was repetitive. But repetition itself brought comfort. People knew what tomorrow would probably look like. And in a harsh environment filled with heat, sickness, injury, and hard labor, that certainty eased fear. Even large building projects moved with patient steadiness. When workers built temples or tombs, they followed methods already proven by earlier generations. Stonecutters shaped blocks beneath the hot sun while foremen watched carefully nearby. Dust settled over skin and clothing. Hammers struck stone with slow rhythmic sounds that echoed through the dry air. At midday, workers rested in narrow patches of shade beside unfinished walls. They drank water slowly and wiped sweat from tired faces. Some stretched aching backs. Others simply closed their eyes for a few moments while warm desert wind drifted through the worksite. Life was physically exhausting for many Egyptians. Most people carried heavy loads daily. Many suffered from worn joints, damaged teeth, eye irritation from blowing sand, and illnesses caused by dirty water or crowded living conditions. Yet even suffering became part of familiar routine. People endured because their parents had endured. And because tomorrow would likely resemble yesterday. In crowded towns, narrow streets baked beneath the afternoon sun. Mud brick walls trapped heat for hours. Merchants sat beneath woven awnings selling onions, dried fish, beer, pottery, sandals, and cloth. Donkeys pushed slowly through crowded spaces while flies circled lazily in the warmth. The smell of baking bread mixed with sweat, river mud, smoke, and animals. Nearby, scribes bent over wooden writing boards inside shaded rooms. Their fingers moved carefully with reed brushes dipped in ink. Scribes held respected positions because writing itself was difficult and required years of training. Most Egyptians could not read. But even the written language changed very slowly. Hieroglyphs remained recognizable across astonishing stretches of time. Ancient symbols survived because Egyptians deeply respected the past. Older texts were copied faithfully. Ancient stories remained valuable simply because they were ancient. Age itself created authority. The old ways carried weight. This respect for tradition reached into nearly every part of Egyptian life. Clothing styles changed slowly. Religious ceremonies stayed familiar. Farming methods remained recognizable across centuries. Even furniture designs often repeated earlier patterns. A stool built long ago might look surprisingly familiar to someone living generations later. To modern minds, this slowness may seem unusual. But for ancient Egyptians, preserving balance mattered more than chasing novelty. New ideas were not automatically welcomed simply because they were new. Consistency meant survival. The land itself encouraged caution. One failed flood season could bring hunger. One season of disease could devastate families. Stability protected communities against uncertainty. As evening approached, workers slowly returned home along dusty roads glowing orange beneath the lowering sun. The heat softened little by little. Long shadows stretched across the fields. Cattle moved lazily toward enclosures while birds circled above the river. Families gathered again inside small homes. Cooking fires flickered. Clay pots simmered quietly. The smell of lentils, onions, and fresh bread drifted through narrow alleys. Children grew sleepy beside their parents while older relatives spoke softly about work, weather, taxes, and river levels. Stories repeated often because familiar stories comforted listeners. Outside, darkness slowly covered the land. And once again, ancient Egypt settled into silence. Far away in the desert, enormous pyramids rested beneath moonlight exactly as they had for generations already. Winds moved softly across their ancient stone surfaces. Nearby tombs remained sealed in darkness. Painted walls deep underground still showed scenes of farming, feasting, fishing, and daily life. Even in death, Egyptians wanted continuity. They hoped the next world would feel familiar too. Fields, food, family, rest. The desire for permanence shaped their entire civilization. Kings certainly came and went. Dynasties rose and weakened. Sometimes invasions disrupted the land. Yet again and again Egypt returned to older patterns. Like the Nile after disturbance, society slowly settled back into recognizable rhythms. For ordinary people, survival often depended less on political events and more on the simple repetition of labor. Wake before sunrise. Work beneath the heat. Carry water. Repair tools. Harvest grain. Sleep briefly. Repeat. And through these endless repeated motions, ancient Egypt remained remarkably stable for long stretches of history. In the cool hours before midnight, the villages became still once more. Oil lamps dimmed. Doors closed softly. Somewhere a baby cried briefly before falling asleep again. Beyond the homes, the Nile flowed quietly through darkness, carrying black water northward beneath endless stars. The same stars watched over fishermen drifting on silent boats. The same stars watched over tired laborers sleeping on rooftops to escape the heat trapped inside their homes. The same stars watched over priests tending temple fires in the late hours before dawn. And beneath those stars, Egypt continued almost exactly as it had the day before. Slowly. Patiently. Quietly. Before the first light touched the Nile, the air carried a brief moment of coolness across the sleeping land. It was the gentlest hour of the day. The desert had not yet begun to burn beneath the sun. The fields rested beneath a pale gray sky, and a thin mist floated low over the river water. In small villages scattered along the Nile banks, people still slept beneath woven blankets and linen cloths. Mud brick walls held the warmth from yesterday's heat. Roofs made from reeds and timber creaked softly in the night wind. A donkey shifted in its sleep beside a courtyard wall. Somewhere nearby, a quiet cough echoed from inside a dark room. Then slowly, almost unnoticed, the world of ancient Egypt began to wake again. A woman rose carefully from a straw sleeping mat so she would not wake the children beside her. Her feet touched the cool floor packed hard by many years of use. In the darkness, she reached for a small clay lamp and coaxed yesterday's embers back into flame. The smell of smoke returned to the room. Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened behind the distant palms. This quiet beginning repeated itself across Egypt every morning for century after century. Families woke at nearly the same hour. Farmers prepared the same tools. Bakers mixed the same grain. Boats drifted toward the same fishing waters. The routines became so deeply rooted in life that many people could hardly imagine another way to live. For most Egyptians, change did not arrive suddenly. It barely arrived at all. And often, when changes did appear, people resisted them softly through habit alone. A worker trusted the method his father had taught him because that method had already survived harsh seasons, poor floods, sickness, and hunger. There was comfort in proven ways. In a farming village south of Memphis, a man stepped outside carrying a wooden hoe across his shoulder. The dirt beneath his sandals felt cool for only a few moments. Soon the sun would rise fully, and the fields would become heavy with heat. He walked beside irrigation canals dug long ago by other hands now forgotten. The canals wound slowly through dark fertile soil left behind by the Nile floods. Reeds whispered quietly along the water's edge. The farmer did not think of himself as part of history. Most people never do. He simply thought about work. About aching muscles. About whether the flood had been generous enough this year. About whether there would be enough grain stored for his family. The rhythm of farming shaped nearly every season of Egyptian life. During flood season, much of the farmland disappeared beneath river water. Villagers repaired homes, cleaned tools, mended fishing nets, or worked on royal building projects while waiting for the waters to fall. When the floods retreated, dark rich soil remained behind like a gift spread across the land. Then planting began. Men walked slowly through muddy fields guiding oxen that pulled simple wooden plows. Seeds scattered from rough baskets into freshly turned earth. Children followed behind chasing birds away from the crops. The work demanded patience more than speed. And patience became part of Egyptian thinking itself. The Nile rarely hurried. The seasons repeated carefully. The stars moved steadily overhead. Why should life move differently? Near the riverbank, fishermen untied small boats from wooden posts driven deep into the mud. Their hands moved automatically after years of repeating the same motions before sunrise. Nets rested in loose coils near their feet. Some boats carried oil lamps that flickered softly in the fading darkness. The fishermen pushed away from shore. Water rippled gently beneath the wooden hulls. In the distance, another village slowly awakened. Thin smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. A dog barked once and then fell silent again. Many Egyptian homes were small and crowded. Entire families often slept in a single room. Furniture remained simple. Clay jars lined walls beside baskets of grain and bundles of reeds. Most people owned very little, but they cared deeply for the objects they had. A cracked bowl might remain in use for years. A woven mat might pass from one generation to another. Nothing was wasted easily. Life beside the Nile required endurance and care. And because resources mattered so much, people avoided unnecessary risks. Sudden changes in farming methods or social customs could threaten stability. A failed experiment might mean hunger. Familiar ways felt safer. This cautious spirit spread upward into government and religion as well. Egyptian rulers often presented themselves not as creators of something new, but as protectors of ancient order. Kings repaired old temples more often than building entirely different styles. Priests preserved rituals exactly. Scribes copied ancient texts word for word. Even language itself carried the weight of tradition. Inside schools for scribes, boys sat cross-legged on floors practicing symbols over and over again beneath the watchful eyes of instructors. Reed brushes scratched against writing surfaces in slow steady rhythms. Mistakes were corrected carefully. Precision mattered. The old forms had to survive unchanged. A skilled scribe could spend long hours copying religious texts or official records while sunlight crept slowly across the room. Dust floated in the warm air. Outside, merchants shouted in crowded streets, but inside the writing room everything remained quiet except for the soft sounds of brushes and breathing. Scribes belonged to one of the few groups in Egyptian society with a chance to rise above hard physical labor. Most workers carried heavy burdens all their lives. Their backs bent beneath stone, grain sacks, timber, or water jars. Their hands grew rough and cracked beneath the dry heat. But scribes sat in shade. They learned. They observed. And because written knowledge passed slowly from teacher to student, scribes became guardians of continuity itself. One old lesson copied by a student might have already existed for hundreds of years. In temple cities, priests also preserved ancient patterns with remarkable care. Before dawn, they entered sacred chambers after washing themselves with water from the Nile. Barefoot and silent, they moved through cool stone halls lit only by flickering lamps. The temple smelled of incense, oil, stone dust, and old linen. Statues of gods waited in shadowed rooms hidden from ordinary people. Priests offered bread, beer, flowers, and prayers in rituals repeated so consistently that they seemed outside of time itself. Every gesture mattered because Egyptians believed order had to be maintained constantly. If rituals stopped, chaos might grow stronger. The desert beyond the fertile land always reminded them how fragile life truly was. Sandstorms could bury roads. Drought could ruin crops. Disease could spread silently through crowded homes. So routines became more than habits. They became protection. At midday, the heat settled heavily across the fields and streets. Workers wiped sweat from their faces using rough linen cloths. Sandals scraped slowly over hot ground. Oxen stood nearly motionless beneath the sun, their sides rising and falling with slow tired breaths. In workshops, craftsmen continued repetitive labor hour after hour. Potters spun clay vessels using methods unchanged for generations. Carpenters shaped stools, chests, and beds from wood carried long distances into Egypt because local trees were scarce. Metal workers hammered bronze tools beside smoky fires while apprentices watched closely, learning exactly how each movement should be done. The sounds of work filled the towns. Hammering, grinding grain, sawing wood, voices bargaining softly in markets, footsteps against stone. Yet beneath all these sounds rested an unusual stillness. Egyptian life often felt steady rather than hurried. Even crowded places moved with a slow rhythm shaped by heat and routine. By late afternoon, shadows stretched longer across the land. Workers began returning home through dusty streets glowing gold beneath the lowering sun. Some carried baskets balanced carefully on their heads. Others guided donkeys loaded with jars or bundles of reeds. Children played beside irrigation canals while mothers prepared evening meals. The smell of onions cooking in oil drifted through village alleys. Nearby, old men sat quietly against sun-warmed walls discussing river levels, taxes, weather, and memories from years long past. Many conversations in ancient Egypt probably sounded similar across generations because daily concerns remained similar too. Would the flood be high enough? Would grain stores last? Would illness pass through the village this season? Would taxes increase again? Life moved within repeating cycles. And because those cycles continued for so long, Egyptians developed deep trust in continuity itself. This trust even shaped their understanding of time. Many ancient cultures imagined time moving toward dramatic endings or transformations. But Egyptian thought often viewed time more like the Nile flood, cyclical, returning, repeating. Sunrise followed darkness. Flood followed drought. Planting followed harvest. Again and again. The universe remained stable because its rhythms continued. As darkness settled over the villages, people gathered on rooftops where cooler night air finally eased the burden of the heat. Families ate simple meals together beneath the stars. Bread tore softly in tired hands. Clay cups passed from person to person. Nearby, someone quietly played music on a reed flute. The melody drifted gently through the warm night. Farther away, dogs barked at movement near the edge of the fields where desert met farmland in a sudden line of darkness. Inside homes, oil lamps flickered against mud brick walls blackened by years of smoke. Children slowly fell asleep while listening to the low voices of adults speaking nearby. Some families told old stories repeated for generations already. Stories of gods traveling through the night sky. Stories of wise rulers. Stories of the Nile itself. These stories mattered because they connected the present to the distant past. Egyptians respected what endured. And little endured more powerfully than memory. Even the dead remained close to daily life. Tombs lined desert cliffs beyond the villages. Families brought food offerings to burial places. Ancestors were remembered not as distant strangers but as continuing members of the household in another form of existence. Death itself was imagined as continuity rather than sudden change. The next world would contain familiar comforts. Fields to walk through. Water to drink. Food to share. Shade to rest beneath. Egyptians prepared carefully for this eternal continuation. Tomb painters covered walls with scenes from ordinary life because ordinary life itself held deep value. Bakers baked bread in painted scenes. Farmers harvested grain. Fishermen pulled nets from the river. The afterlife was not imagined as something completely different. It was imagined as life made steady forever. And perhaps this reveals something important about why change remained rare in ancient Egypt for so long. The people did not spend their lives searching for new worlds. They spent their lives protecting the one they already knew. Outside beneath the stars, the Nile continued flowing quietly northward through darkness. Boats drifted slowly on black water. Reeds bent gently in the warm wind. In the distance, temple columns stood silent beneath moonlight. Their shadows stretched across empty courtyards where priests would soon walk again before dawn. And as another night deepened over Egypt, countless sleeping families rested within the same ancient rhythms that had guided their parents and grandparents before them. Quiet rhythms. Slow rhythms. Rhythms that seemed almost eternal beneath the endless desert sky. Long before the sun appeared over the eastern horizon, the Nile was already awake. Dark water moved silently between the riverbanks, carrying bits of reeds, drifting leaves, and the faint reflection of stars that still lingered overhead. Small waves touched the muddy shore with soft repetitive sounds. Insects hummed in the thick air near the marshes. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried once across the darkness and then became quiet again. The villages beside the river remained mostly asleep. Mud brick walls stood pale beneath the moonlight. Roofs made from bundled reeds held the warmth of the previous day. Narrow alleys between homes were empty except for a few wandering dogs and the occasional shadow of someone rising early for work. In one small house, an old woman sat awake beside a fading oil lamp. Sleep had become lighter with age. Her hands rested quietly in her lap while she listened to the familiar sounds outside. She had lived beside the Nile her entire life. The river sounded the same now as it had when she was a child. That sameness mattered to her. It mattered to nearly everyone. Ancient Egypt was a land deeply attached to repetition because repetition brought reassurance. People did not wake each morning expecting the world to become new. They woke expecting the world to continue. And usually, it did. The floodwaters returned. The fields greened again. Children grew older. Temples opened before dawn. The sun crossed the sky in its familiar path. In many ways, Egyptian life felt less like a straight road and more like a circle turning slowly through time. As the eastern sky softened from black to deep blue, movement slowly returned to the villages. A young boy stepped sleepily into a courtyard carrying a clay jar almost too heavy for him. His bare feet pressed into cool dirt still damp from the night air. Nearby, his mother knelt beside a grinding stone preparing grain for the morning meal. The sound of stone against grain echoed softly through the quiet dawn. It was one of the oldest sounds in Egypt. Women across the land performed the same exhausting labor every day. Grinding grain required strength and patience. Backs ached. Arms grew tired. Fine dust clung to skin and clothing. Yet the work continued hour after hour because bread remained the center of nearly every meal. Even food habits changed slowly. Bread, beer, onions, lentils, fish from the Nile, dates, figs. Simple meals repeated across generations. The familiar taste of daily food became part of the stability people trusted. Outside the village, farmers were already gathering near the fields while the air still carried traces of coolness. Some walked beside oxen. Others carried wooden hoes polished smooth from years of use. The irrigation canals reflected pale morning light while frogs disappeared into the water at the sound of approaching footsteps. No one rushed. The heat would come soon enough. There was always work waiting. And there would still be work tomorrow. The slow repetition of labor shaped the Egyptian understanding of life itself. Most people expected to continue the occupation of their parents. Sons of fishermen often became fishermen. Daughters of bakers learned baking. Stoneworkers trained young boys who watched carefully from childhood onward. Skills passed quietly through generations. There was little reason to reinvent what already functioned well enough. This practical conservatism helped Egyptian society remain remarkably stable for long periods. Methods that survived harsh conditions became trusted deeply. Even when better techniques may have existed elsewhere, Egypt often adopted them slowly. The land rewarded patience more than speed. Along the riverbanks, fishermen pushed narrow wooden boats into the water as dawn finally arrived. Mist hovered above the Nile in thin silver layers. The fishermen moved carefully to avoid tangling nets before sunrise. One older fisherman sat near the edge of the boat repairing torn rope by hand. His fingers worked automatically without needing much thought. He had repaired nets the same way for decades. His father had done the same. And likely his grandfather before him. The river itself encouraged continuity because it remained the center of everything. Roads through the desert were difficult and dangerous, but the Nile connected towns and cities gently across enormous distances. Boats carried grain, stone, timber, pottery, and people north and south through the kingdom. Yet even with this connection, Egypt remained somewhat protected from rapid outside influence. Deserts formed natural barriers around much of the land. To the west stretched endless dry emptiness. To the east lay harsh rocky wilderness leading toward the Red Sea. The geography sheltered Egypt. And sheltered societies often change more slowly. In crowded towns farther north, workshops slowly opened for the day. Potters arranged freshly shaped vessels outside to dry in the warming sunlight. Carpenters swept sawdust from packed earth floors. Metal workers stirred old ashes inside bronze furnaces while apprentices carried charcoal and tools. The workshops smelled of smoke, clay, sweat, and heated metal. Many workers spent nearly their entire lives mastering only one narrow craft. Repetition built skill. Skill built survival. In one weaving room, several women sat together beside upright looms. Their fingers moved patiently through strands of linen thread while sunlight filtered through a narrow window opening high in the wall. Dust floated through the bright beams of light. The work was slow, careful, rhythmic. Conversations drifted softly through the room while the looms creaked gently back and forth. Much of Egyptian life moved at this pace. Not fast enough to create constant disruption. Not slow enough to stop entirely. Instead, life flowed steadily like the river beside it. And because so many people depended on predictable routines, society developed powerful resistance to sudden change. Even rulers understood this. A pharaoh might build new monuments or expand borders during military campaigns, but he also needed to present himself as a protector of ancient order. Egyptian kings often described themselves not as inventors, but as restorers. Their duty was to preserve balance between gods, nature, and society. The concept of balance rested at the center of Egyptian thinking. Order against chaos. Stability against disorder. The desert beyond the Nile Valley served as a constant reminder of what chaos looked like. Beyond the fertile strip lay silence, heat, thirst, and emptiness. Sandstorms could erase roads overnight. Travelers could disappear beneath the endless dunes. But near the Nile, life continued. Green plants grew. Children played. Boats floated. Markets opened. And so Egyptians learned to treasure continuity almost as a sacred thing. By midday, the sun hung heavily over the land. White stone walls reflected harsh light into narrow streets. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads to shield themselves from the burning heat. Animals gathered beneath scraps of shade wherever they could find relief. Inside homes, the air became thick and still. Women poured water carefully from storage jars cooled slightly by evaporation. Young children slept through the hottest hours on woven mats spread across floors. Elderly relatives rested against walls with tired eyes half closed. The heat slowed everything. Voices became softer. Movements smaller. Outside, even the flies seemed lazy in the afternoon brightness. In temple complexes, priests continued their duties despite the heat. Sacred routines could not pause simply because the day grew uncomfortable. Incense drifted upward through dark chambers while prayers echoed softly from stone walls. Temple life followed strict patterns repeated across generations. At dawn the gods received food offerings. At certain hours sacred songs were sung. Statues were washed and clothed carefully. The same rituals continued day after day for centuries. Young priests learned exact procedures from older priests who had once learned from elders themselves. Deviating from tradition felt dangerous because tradition linked the living world to divine stability. And stability mattered more than almost anything else in ancient Egypt. Even architecture reflected this desire for permanence. Builders preferred strong familiar forms. Massive stone temples stood with thick columns and heavy walls designed to endure beneath the desert sun for ages beyond memory. Workers hauling limestone blocks beneath the heat probably understood that the buildings they created would outlive them completely. Still they worked. Slowly. Patiently. Teams of laborers dragged stone across wooden sledges while foremen shouted measured instructions. Sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust covered skin and hair. Water carriers moved among the workers offering brief relief from the heat. At night, many laborers returned to cramped sleeping quarters with sore backs and swollen hands. Meals were simple. Sleep came quickly after long days of physical exhaustion. Yet even large state projects relied on routines rather than sudden bursts of innovation. Workers organized themselves according to familiar systems. Supplies arrived along known routes. Scribes recorded inventories carefully on papyrus and limestone flakes. The machinery of Egyptian civilization moved steadily because everyone understood their role within it. Most people were not trying to escape the system. They were trying to survive inside it. As evening finally approached, cooler winds began drifting across the Nile Valley. Farmers slowly left the fields carrying tools over tired shoulders. Fishermen returned with the day's catch stored in baskets smelling of river water and reeds. Smoke rose from cooking fires across the villages. The smell of bread baking returned once again. Children ran barefoot through dusty streets while mothers called them home before darkness settled fully over the land. Donkeys brayed near storage yards. Somewhere nearby, someone played a quiet tune on a harp while neighbors talked softly outside their homes. The stars emerged slowly overhead. Ancient Egyptians watched those stars carefully. The sky itself seemed ordered and dependable. Constellations returned season after season just as the floods returned. Priests tracked celestial movements closely because heavenly order reflected earthly order. Everything connected. River, sky, flood, harvest, temple, family, routine. This interconnected stability became one reason Egypt endured for so long with relatively gradual change. When systems feel connected to nature itself, people hesitate to alter them quickly. Night deepened slowly across the villages. Families gathered on rooftops where cooler air moved gently through the darkness. Oil lamps flickered beside sleeping mats. Some people shared quiet stories while others simply rested in silence after the exhausting day. Nearby, the Nile continued its endless movement northward beneath the stars. A fisherman drifting quietly on dark water might have looked toward the distant glow of temple fires and felt that the world around him had always existed this way. And perhaps, in many ways, it had. Generations had lived and died beside the same river. Children had grown into old age beneath the same sun. Fields had flooded and dried thousands of times. The old woman awake before dawn. The scribes bent over their writing boards. The laborers dragging stone. The women grinding grain in shadowed courtyards. All of them belonged to rhythms so ancient that no living person could remember their true beginning. And so the nights of Egypt remained calm and familiar. The same river sounds. The same warm wind. The same distant barking dogs. The same soft glow of lamps fading one by one into darkness. Until once again, long before sunrise, the Nile would awaken first. The Nile moved through the darkness with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. Its black surface reflected broken pieces of starlight while slow currents carried cool night air across the sleeping villages. Along the muddy banks, reeds swayed softly in the breeze. Frogs rested in the shallows. Fishing boats drifted gently against wooden posts tied with old rope worn smooth by many hands over many years. Most homes were quiet now. Families slept close together beneath thin linen cloths. The day's heat still lingered inside the mud brick walls, though the rooftops above had cooled slightly beneath the night sky. In narrow streets between homes, stray dogs searched silently for scraps beside baskets and broken pottery. Farther away, beyond the green edge of the river valley, the desert stretched outward beneath the moonlight. Pale dunes rested motionless under the stars. Dry hills rose like sleeping shapes against the horizon. The desert always remained nearby. Egyptians could never fully forget it. Even in peaceful times, the contrast between fertile land and endless sand shaped the way people understood life. One side held water, grain, shelter, and community. The other held silence, thirst, and uncertainty. Perhaps that is one reason why Egyptians held so tightly to routines that worked. Life already balanced close enough to hardship. Sudden change could disturb that balance. And so people repeated the old ways. Again and again. Season after season. Year after year. Long before dawn, movement began quietly inside a baker's home near a busy market town. The baker woke while the stars were still bright overhead. He rubbed sleep from his eyes and stepped carefully around his children sleeping on woven mats nearby. The room smelled faintly of old smoke and grain dust. Outside in the courtyard, yesterday's oven still held traces of warmth beneath its clay walls. The baker knelt beside it and slowly rekindled the fire using dry reeds and scraps of wood gathered earlier in the week. Soon the smell of smoke spread into the cool darkness. His wife began grinding grain nearby using a heavy stone worn smooth from years of labor. The slow scraping sound blended softly with distant river water and the occasional cry of waking birds. This morning ritual was older than memory. Bread fed Egypt. And because bread mattered so deeply, the routine surrounding it rarely changed. The same grains were crushed. The same dough was shaped. The same ovens glowed before sunrise. Even the smell of baking bread probably remained familiar across centuries. As the eastern sky slowly brightened, more of the town awakened. Water carriers walked toward the Nile balancing empty jars across their shoulders. Laborers emerged from crowded sleeping quarters rubbing stiff muscles from yesterday's work. Donkeys stamped impatiently beside storage yards while merchants unlocked wooden shutters covering small market stalls. The sounds of morning slowly gathered together. Footsteps. Low voices. Grinding grain. Creaking carts. Splashing water. Egyptian towns could feel crowded and noisy by midday, but the early hours remained softer. The cool air encouraged slower movement. Workers often tried to finish difficult labor before the strongest heat arrived. Near the river docks, fishermen unloaded baskets filled with silver fish glistening faintly in the dawn light. The smell of river mud mixed with fresh catch and wet reeds. Nearby, scribes sat beside stacks of goods recording deliveries with careful attention. Writing itself reinforced Egypt's stability. Scribes preserved laws, taxes, prayers, business records, and royal decrees. Because so much information was copied repeatedly through generations, old systems survived. A method written centuries earlier could continue influencing daily life simply because scribes kept preserving it faithfully. Young students training to become scribes lived difficult lives despite the respect attached to their profession. Teachers expected discipline and precision. Boys copied symbols over and over while sitting cross-legged on hard floors inside warm schoolrooms. Mistakes brought punishment. Accuracy mattered deeply. The students memorized ancient phrases that had already been repeated by countless earlier students. Their education connected them directly to the past. Many eventually spent their adult lives copying old texts whose origins were already ancient. In this way, Egypt carried its memory forward carefully. Not quickly. Not carelessly. But patiently. Near one temple complex, gardeners worked quietly beside pools filled with lotus flowers. Palm trees cast long shadows across stone pathways while priests prepared for morning rituals inside the sanctuary. Temples were among the most stable places in Egyptian life. Dynasties changed. Officials rose and disappeared. But temples often remained active for centuries. Some priests spent their entire lives serving inside the same sacred walls their fathers had known before them. The rituals they performed each morning had already been repeated thousands of times. Wash the sacred statue. Light incense. Present food offerings. Speak the prayers. Maintain divine order. The repetition itself held meaning. To Egyptians, the world remained safe because sacred routines continued correctly. This deep respect for continuity affected architecture too. Builders favored forms already trusted by tradition. Temple columns resembled bundled reeds or palm trunks. Walls displayed familiar scenes of offerings, harvests, ceremonies, and river life. Art changed slowly because its purpose was not personal expression in the modern sense. Its purpose was permanence. Painters inside tombs followed established styles carefully. Human figures appeared in recognizable poses repeated across generations. Colors carried symbolic meanings preserved through long tradition. A tomb painter working beneath dim oil lamps deep underground might spend months decorating walls with scenes of ordinary activities. Fishing, baking, farming, boating, music, feasting. These scenes mattered because Egyptians hoped familiar comforts would continue after death. The next life was imagined not as a strange unknown place, but as a perfected continuation of earthly life beside the Nile. This longing for continuity shaped nearly every corner of Egyptian culture. Even furniture remained consistent for remarkably long periods. Beds stood on familiar wooden frames. Headrests supported sleeping heads above woven mats. Chests stored clothing and tools much as they had for generations already. Daily life moved within trusted patterns. And those patterns survived because most people wanted stability more than novelty. By late morning, the heat had already begun pressing heavily against the land. Workers wiped sweat from dusty skin while sunlight reflected sharply from white stone walls and pale sand roads. At construction sites, laborers strained together hauling limestone blocks beneath shouted instructions from overseers. Thick ropes dug into tired hands. Sandals slipped in loose dirt. The smell of sweat, dust, and hot stone filled the air. Some workers sang softly while pulling in rhythm together. Others remained silent from exhaustion. Most large building projects depended not on sudden brilliance, but on careful organization repeated steadily over time. Egyptian civilization excelled at maintaining systems patiently for generations. Food deliveries arrived. Tools were repaired. Workers rotated shifts. Scribes tracked supplies. The routines continued. And because they continued so reliably, Egypt accomplished enormous projects without requiring constant reinvention. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers far from royal monuments continued lives that changed even less. A farming family in Upper Egypt may have experienced little difference between one ruler and the next. Taxes might rise or fall slightly. Officials might change. But daily routines stayed familiar. Wake before dawn. Fetch water. Work the fields. Care for animals. Prepare meals. Sleep. Repeat. The predictability of this cycle shaped emotional life as much as economic life. People found comfort in knowing what tomorrow would probably demand from them. In uncertain worlds, routine becomes a kind of shelter. During the hottest hours of afternoon, many towns grew quieter. Workers rested where they could find shade. Children slept beside walls cooled slightly by damp cloths. Dogs lay motionless beneath carts. The air itself felt heavy. Even conversation slowed beneath the heat. In wealthier homes, servants moved quietly through shaded courtyards carrying water jars or preparing evening meals. Wealthy Egyptians certainly enjoyed comforts unavailable to laborers, yet even elite life followed deeply traditional patterns. Noble families arranged ceremonies according to old customs. Officials wore familiar clothing styles. Banquets served foods people had eaten for centuries. Respectability itself depended partly on honoring tradition. To reject old ways too openly could appear dangerous or foolish. As afternoon slowly softened into evening, the light over the Nile Valley turned golden and calm. Palm shadows stretched longer across irrigation canals. Farmers guided animals back toward enclosures. Fishermen repaired nets while sitting beside the riverbank listening to evening insects rising from the reeds. The smell of cooking fires returned gradually across the villages. Flatbread baked against hot clay walls. Stew simmered slowly in blackened pots. Children laughed somewhere beyond the narrow alleys. Nearby, old women sat together spinning thread while discussing marriages, illnesses, river levels, and memories from many seasons ago. Much of Egyptian life was carried through conversation rather than written record. Stories, advice, warnings, and traditions passed quietly from older generations into younger ones during these evening hours. A grandmother teaching a child how to shape dough. A father showing his son how to mend fishing nets. An older laborer explaining how to avoid injury while hauling stone. Knowledge moved person to person slowly. And because it moved slowly, traditions remained durable. Night descended carefully over the land. Stars emerged above the dark silhouette of palms. Temple fires flickered faintly in the distance. Families climbed onto rooftops seeking cooler air before sleep. Some lay quietly watching the stars while warm wind drifted across the Nile Valley carrying scents of water, mud, smoke, and distant flowers growing near the marshes. The river continued flowing steadily northward. It had flowed before the oldest temples were built. It had flowed before the oldest stories were first spoken aloud. And for the people of ancient Egypt, that endless flowing water became a symbol of something deeply comforting. Continuity. The quiet promise that life would return again tomorrow in familiar form. That the ovens would glow before sunrise. That fishermen would push boats into the mist. That scribes would dip reeds into ink. That farmers would walk slowly toward the fields beneath the pale morning sky. And beneath the endless stars, Egypt rested peacefully inside those ancient repeating rhythms once more. Night settled more deeply now, not with suddenness, but with the slow lowering of darkness that always seemed to come gently over the Nile Valley. The last warmth of the day still lingered in the stones of the homes and the dry earth of the streets, but above it all, a cooler air began to move through the palms and along the river banks. The river did not change with the night. It continued its steady path northward, as it always had, as it always would seem to do. Boats rested quietly along the shore, tied with rope that had softened over many seasons of use. The water touched their sides with small, patient movements, as if even the river itself was resting but never fully still. In the villages, lamps flickered one by one. A soft glow appeared in small windows. Then faded. Then appeared again in another home nearby. Life in ancient Egypt did not truly stop at night, but it softened. It folded inward. It became quieter, closer, more contained. The world narrowed to what was immediately necessary, and everything else waited for morning. Inside one home near a narrow canal, a family remained awake a little longer than most. A father sat against the wall, his shoulders slightly bent from years of field work. His hands rested loosely in his lap, still rough with soil that never fully washed away. Across from him, his wife carefully repaired a woven basket. Her fingers moved slowly, repeating the same motion again and again, threading plant fibers back into place. The basket had been used for grain, for carrying food, for collecting small harvests. It would be used again tomorrow. And so it was repaired. Not replaced. Not changed. Just restored to what it already was. This small act reflected something larger about Egyptian life. Repair was more common than replacement. Preservation was more natural than innovation. Objects, methods, and traditions were often extended rather than discarded. In a land where resources required careful balance, this habit became part of everyday thinking. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the village. It carried the faint smell of river water, damp earth, and smoke from cooking fires now reduced to glowing embers. Somewhere in the distance, a child coughed softly in sleep. A dog shifted position near a doorway. A donkey exhaled slowly beside a stable wall. Everything remained familiar. Everything remained steady. Even time itself seemed to repeat rather than rush forward. In many homes, people prepared for sleep in nearly identical ways. Mats were laid out. Thin blankets were adjusted. Clay jars of water were placed within reach for the morning. Sandals were left near doorways, always in the same place, ready for another day of use. These small routines mattered. They created order within the home, just as larger routines created order within society. And order, in ancient Egypt, was something deeply valued. Not as an abstract idea, but as a lived experience. Order meant knowing what to expect. It meant the river would rise and fall in a familiar rhythm. It meant crops would grow when planted at the right time. It meant the world would continue in ways that could be understood. Far from the villages, in a temple complex partially lit by oil lamps, priests continued their quiet duties even as most of the land slept. Stone corridors stretched long and cool beneath carved ceilings. The air inside was still, almost untouched by the heat of the day now fading far outside. A priest walked slowly through the corridor carrying a small vessel of water drawn earlier from the Nile. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor. Ahead of him, the sanctuary remained dim, lit only by a few carefully placed lamps that cast moving shadows along painted walls. The statues inside were not treated as simple objects. They were treated as living presences. Carefully, the priest washed the sacred space in a ritual that had been performed in nearly the same way for generations beyond memory. Water touched stone. Incense was prepared. A prayer was spoken in a low, steady voice. Nothing about the act was hurried. Nothing was improvised. The ritual was repetition itself. And repetition, in this world, was believed to maintain balance between the human and divine realms. Outside the temple, the night remained still. Inside, Time felt layered with memory. Across Egypt, similar rituals were being completed in other temples, each one following patterns that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. Even when small differences appeared, they were carefully absorbed into tradition rather than replacing it. Change, when it came, moved slowly. Almost cautiously. It had to pass through many layers of acceptance before becoming part of daily life. This slow movement of change was not simply cultural preference. It was also shaped by the structure of Egyptian society itself. Authority flowed downward from the pharaoh, through officials, scribes, priests, and local leaders. Each level of society reinforced existing systems rather than constantly redesigning them. A farmer in a distant village did not directly reshape laws or customs. A craftsman did not redefine religious practice. A scribe did not easily alter the structure of government records. Instead, each person worked within established patterns that had already been tested across time. In the early hours before midnight, the village near the canal became almost completely silent. Even the wind seemed to slow. The sky above was filled with countless stars, steady and unmoving to the human eye, forming patterns that priests and farmers alike had learned to recognize. The same stars appeared each night. The same constellations returned each season. They offered another quiet reminder that the universe itself seemed ordered and repetitive. A young man lying awake on a rooftop watched those stars with half-closed eyes. He was a laborer, tired from a long day of hauling grain sacks at a storage yard near the river. His body ached in the way that came from repeated effort, not sudden strain. He thought little about distant cities or changing rulers. His thoughts remained close to home. Tomorrow's work. The weight of grain. The heat returning again with sunrise. The familiar path to the fields. And slowly, without even noticing, his thoughts drifted into sleep while the night deepened around him. Farther along the river, a small fishing boat remained anchored near the shore. The fisherman inside had not returned home yet. He lay wrapped in a thin cloth beneath the open sky, listening to the gentle movement of water against wood. His net rested beside him, repaired earlier in the evening. He too understood repetition. Tomorrow would be much like today. The same currents. The same fishing spots. The same early hour before dawn when boats left the shore. And if the river changed at all, it did so in ways so gradual that a single human life could barely perceive it. This is part of why change in ancient Egypt often felt rare. Not because nothing ever changed, but because change arrived so slowly that it blended into continuity. Generations might pass before a new practice became common. Even then, it often existed alongside older methods rather than replacing them entirely. Old and new could coexist for long periods, layered together like sediment slowly forming along the riverbanks. In the sleeping village, a faint sound rose briefly from somewhere near the fields. Perhaps a night animal moving through crops. Perhaps the wind shifting through reeds. It lasted only a moment before fading back into silence. The homes remained still. The lamps dimmed further. And the world seemed to rest inside itself. Near dawn, long before the sun would rise again, the Nile Valley held its quietest moment. The air cooled slightly. The sky above began to lighten just a little at the edges, though the stars still shone clearly. This was the hour between darkness and return. The hour when Egypt waited without yet knowing it was about to wake again. And in that waiting, nothing felt new. Only familiar. Only continuous. Only the same gentle rhythm that had carried the land through countless generations already, and would continue carrying it forward, one slow day at a time, beside the steady flow of the ancient river. The first birds began calling before the sky had fully changed color. Their sounds drifted softly across the riverbanks and through the narrow streets of sleeping villages. The calls were small and distant at first, almost hidden beneath the quiet movement of water and wind. Then gradually, as darkness thinned over the Nile Valley, more sounds joined them. A door creaked open. Sandals brushed against packed earth. A clay jar touched stone. Morning returned carefully to ancient Egypt. The eastern horizon carried a pale silver glow now. Palm trees stood dark against the brightening sky, their leaves barely moving in the early breeze. Thin mist hovered low over irrigation canals and marshes beside the Nile, softening the edges of the land. The coolness would not last long. Already the promise of heat rested in the air. Inside a small house near the edge of a farming village, a mother leaned over a sleeping child and gently brushed dust from his forehead. The room still smelled of warm clay walls, woven mats, and yesterday's cooking fire. Near the doorway, baskets and tools waited exactly where they had been left the night before. Nothing had shifted. Nothing needed rearranging. The order of the room reflected the order of life itself. Outside, her husband was already awake, kneeling beside a water jar and splashing his face before the day's labor began again. His movements were slow from habit rather than tiredness. He had repeated this same routine for so many years that it no longer required thought. Wash. Dress. Lift the tools. Walk toward the fields. The body remembered. Throughout Egypt, millions of small repeated actions shaped the rhythm of society. These actions were not written into royal inscriptions or carved into temple walls, yet they formed the true foundation of Egyptian continuity. Ordinary repetition kept the civilization steady. Not grand speeches. Not dramatic events. But small familiar routines carried out every single day. In the growing light of dawn, the village slowly filled with movement. Women walked toward the river carrying empty jars balanced against their hips or shoulders. Some spoke quietly together as they walked. Others remained silent, still waking fully beneath the cool morning air. The riverbank smelled of wet mud and reeds. Feet pressed softly into damp earth. Water poured into clay jars with hollow bubbling sounds. Nearby, fishermen prepared their boats in almost complete silence. One man carefully folded a net repaired many times over. Another checked the edges of a wooden paddle worn smooth by years of use. The boats themselves looked ancient even when newly built because Egyptian boat designs changed only gradually across long stretches of time. Builders trusted forms already proven safe upon the river. The Nile rewarded reliability. A poorly built boat could overturn. A weak rope could snap. A failed harvest could bring hunger. In such conditions, people naturally valued methods that had already survived many difficult seasons. As the sun slowly rose above the eastern horizon, golden light spread across the fields beside the Nile. The fertile earth darkened with moisture left behind by irrigation channels. Workers entered the fields carrying hoes and baskets while birds circled overhead searching for insects stirred by human movement. The farmers bent to their labor without ceremony. The work simply needed doing. And it would need doing again tomorrow. This endless repetition shaped the emotional world of ordinary Egyptians. Most people were born into a life already organized by expectations older than their grandparents. Occupations, family duties, religious practices, and social roles were deeply rooted. There was comfort in knowing one's place. But there was also limitation. A farmer's son rarely imagined becoming something entirely different. A potter's daughter usually learned pottery. Knowledge flowed along family lines and local traditions. And because people stayed connected to the same work across generations, ancient methods remained alive. Near one field, an elderly farmer paused briefly to stretch his aching back. The morning sun had already begun warming the air. Sweat darkened the linen cloth tied around his waist. Beside him, a younger worker guided oxen slowly through the soil. The older man watched quietly for a moment, then corrected the younger worker's grip on the plow. Not harshly, simply carefully. This is how skills survived in ancient Egypt. Person to person, hand to hand, through observation and repetition. Many techniques were never written down at all. They lived only in practice. And because of this, change naturally moved slowly. New ideas had to pass through generations of habit before becoming fully accepted. Farther north, in a crowded town along the river, merchants were already arranging goods beneath shaded awnings. Baskets of onions sat beside pottery jars and folded linen cloth. Dried fish hung from wooden poles while flies drifted lazily through the warming air. The market slowly filled with sound. Low conversations. Footsteps. Donkeys snorting impatiently. Children weaving through the crowd. Even here, where travelers occasionally brought stories from distant lands, Egyptian life remained deeply attached to continuity. Foreign goods sometimes arrived by trade routes crossing deserts or seas, yet ordinary people often continued using familiar local products and traditions. New influences entered slowly, filtered carefully through older customs. A merchant might admire a foreign object while still arranging his own stall exactly as his father once had. In nearby workshops, craftsmen continued their labor beneath the growing heat. Potters shaped clay vessels beside spinning wheels. Stonecutters chipped carefully at blocks destined for tombs or temples. Jewelers bent over delicate work illuminated by narrow beams of sunlight entering through high windows. The smell of dust, smoke, and heated stone filled the air. Many workshops belonged to families who had practiced the same craft for generations. Children learned by watching older relatives from an early age. They memorized familiar patterns before understanding them fully. A young apprentice shaping clay today might unknowingly repeat hand movements perfected hundreds of years earlier. This continuity gave Egyptian craftsmanship a recognizable stability across centuries. Styles evolved, but slowly. Always slowly. Inside temple complexes, priests completed morning rituals while sunlight spread across open courtyards lined with enormous columns. The stone still held traces of coolness from the night. Incense drifted upward through shafts of light while sacred chants echoed softly against carved walls. A young priest carried fresh bread and beer toward a shrine deep inside the sanctuary. The offerings were simple, familiar foods eaten daily by ordinary people too. Egyptian religion often reflected the rhythms of everyday life rather than separating itself entirely from it. The gods were offered meals. The gods were clothed. The gods rested. Divine life mirrored human life in many ways. And because religion reinforced existing social patterns, it strengthened continuity throughout society. Even the pharaoh was expected to preserve cosmic balance rather than radically reshape the world. Kings presented themselves as guardians of order handed down from ancient times. To rule well meant maintaining harmony, protecting tradition, ensuring the Nile floods continued properly, keeping temples functioning, preventing chaos. This understanding discouraged dramatic transformation. Stability itself became a sacred ideal. By midday, heat settled heavily across the land once again. The bright sky shimmered above fields and rooftops. Workers moved more slowly now, conserving energy beneath the burning sun. Animals gathered wherever patches of shade could be found. Inside homes, women prepared the main meal of the day while younger children rested nearby. Bread baked against clay oven walls. Lentils simmered in pots over small fires. The smell of cooking drifted through narrow alleys along with smoke and warm dust. Meals remained simple because simplicity was sustainable. Most families could not afford extravagance. And so everyday life centered on dependable essentials. Bread, water, beer, onions, fish, dates. These foods nourished generations without needing reinvention. In the hottest hours of afternoon, even conversation quieted. The land itself seemed sleepy beneath the heavy sunlight. Palm leaves barely moved. Dogs rested motionless against cool walls. Workers wiped sweat from their faces and waited for evening relief. Then gradually, as shadows lengthened once more, movement returned. Farmers gathered tools. Fishermen repaired nets beside the river. Children ran laughing through dusty streets. The heat loosened its grip little by little. And Egypt returned once again to the softer rhythm of evening. Families gathered outside homes while the sky turned gold above the Nile. Older relatives shared stories already told many times before. Young children listened while chewing pieces of warm bread. The stories changed very little with each retelling. That was part of their comfort. People did not always seek surprise from stories. Often they sought familiarity. A reminder that life remained connected to what came before. As darkness slowly spread across the land again, lamps flickered to life inside homes and temples. The river reflected strips of moonlight between moving reeds. Boats rocked gently against their moorings. And all across Egypt, millions of ordinary people prepared once more for sleep beneath the same stars their ancestors had known. Tomorrow would arrive much like today. The ovens would glow before dawn. The priests would light incense. The scribes would sharpen reed pens. The farmers would walk toward the fields. And the Nile, patient and eternal beneath the night sky, would continue carrying the quiet rhythms of Egypt forward through time. The night deepened slowly over the Nile Valley, spreading across the fields and villages like dark water poured gently over stone. One by one, the last sounds of evening faded into stillness. The chatter of children disappeared behind mud brick walls. Cooking fires settled into dim red embers. Even the donkeys tethered beside storage yards lowered their heads and became quiet. Above the land, the stars remained sharp and endless. The people of ancient Egypt knew those stars well. Farmers watched them to understand the seasons. Priests studied them from temple rooftops during the cool hours before dawn. Boatmen drifting along the Nile followed familiar patterns in the sky just as they followed familiar bends in the river. The heavens themselves appeared stable. And stability was deeply comforting. In a small riverside settlement, an elderly fisherman sat awake outside his home long after his family had fallen asleep. The night breeze moved softly across his face, carrying the scent of wet reeds and river mud. His hands rested on a folded fishing net spread across his knees. The net needed repair again. It always needed repair. Under the dim light of a small oil lamp, his fingers moved carefully through the fibers. Tie. Pull. Tighten. Repeat. The motions were so familiar that they no longer required much thought. He had learned them as a child sitting beside his father near the same river. Now his own son repaired nets the same way nearby during daylight hours. Nothing about the work felt temporary. It belonged to a chain stretching backward through time. This quiet inheritance shaped much of Egyptian life. Knowledge was not usually treated as something entirely new waiting to be discovered. More often, wisdom meant preserving what earlier generations had already learned. Old ways carried authority because they had survived. The river had tested them. The heat had tested them. Time itself had tested them. And so people trusted them. Farther inland, beyond the fertile strip of farmland, the desert rested beneath pale moonlight. Low hills cast soft shadows across the sand. Wind moved slowly over the dunes, erasing footprints almost as soon as they appeared. Egyptians often viewed the desert with both fear and respect. It bordered their world constantly, reminding them how fragile life could become without water and order. Beyond the green valley lay emptiness vast enough to swallow travelers completely. The fertile land beside the Nile felt precious because of this contrast. And precious things are often protected carefully from unnecessary change. Before dawn, temple servants quietly entered storage rooms carrying baskets of grain, oil jars, and folded linen. The stone corridors were cool beneath bare feet. Oil lamps flickered against painted walls covered in scenes already ancient to the people walking past them. The artwork showed familiar images. Offerings. Harvests. Boats on the Nile. Priests before the gods. The same themes appeared again and again because Egyptian art was not meant to surprise. It was meant to preserve continuity. The paintings connected the present moment to sacred traditions stretching deep into the past. A young temple apprentice paused briefly beside one painted wall while carrying a basket of bread. He had passed this scene many times already, yet it still held his attention. The figures looked calm and orderly beneath painted stars. Their gestures appeared timeless. In many ways, that timelessness was intentional. Egyptian civilization admired endurance. What lasted was considered meaningful. The apprentice continued deeper into the temple where older priests were already preparing for the first rituals of morning. Incense smoke drifted upward through dim chambers. The air smelled of oil, dust, linen, and faint traces of perfume used in sacred ceremonies. Outside the temple walls, dawn slowly approached once more. The eastern horizon lightened gently. Birds stirred among the reeds. And another day prepared to begin almost exactly like the last. In villages across Egypt, women rose before sunrise to begin grinding grain. The sound spread gradually through the quiet streets like a slow rhythm returning to life. Stone against stone. Again. 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 The labor was exhausting. Hours bent over heavy grinding stones wore down shoulders and backs. Fine grain dust clung to skin and settled into the air inside homes. Yet this work continued daily because bread remained essential to survival. Most people spent large portions of their lives repeating physically demanding tasks. Fetching water. Preparing grain. Repairing tools. Carrying loads. Tending animals. These routines consumed time and energy. There was little space left for constant experimentation or dramatic personal reinvention. Survival depended on consistency. A young boy walked beside his mother toward the river carrying a small clay jar. His feet kicked up dust from the narrow path while early sunlight slowly spread across the water. Other villagers moved in the same direction, all carrying jars or baskets. The riverbank soon filled with familiar morning activity. Water splashed into containers. Women exchanged quiet greetings. Children chased each other briefly before being called back to work. Nearby, fishermen prepared boats exactly as they had yesterday and the day before that. One older boatman checked the knots securing a sail while his younger helper untangled fishing lines beside him. The older man corrected the boy's work several times without anger, only patience. No. Like this. Then again. No. Slower. Skills were taught carefully because mistakes carried consequences. A damaged net meant less food. A poorly tied rope could cost a boat. Reliability mattered more than speed. This patient teaching style reinforced continuity across generations. Young people learned not only techniques, but also habits of caution and repetition. The Nile itself rewarded careful timing. Farmers could not ignore seasonal cycles. Planting too early or too late risked losing crops. Irrigation channels required maintenance at familiar intervals. Harvests followed rhythms shaped by the river's behavior. Nature encouraged regularity. And society reflected nature. As the morning brightened, workers moved steadily into the fields. Some carried hoes over their shoulders. Others guided oxen through damp soil darkened by irrigation water. Birds followed nearby searching for insects disturbed by human movement. The farmers rarely worked alone. Families labored together. Neighbors shared tasks. Entire communities depended on cooperation shaped by long-established expectations. One farmer might borrow tools from another because their fathers had done the same. Labor was often exchanged through relationships built slowly across generations. Trust developed over time, and stable customs helped maintain that trust. In crowded market towns farther north, the streets slowly filled with movement and heat. Merchants arranged goods beneath woven shades while flies circled lazily through the warm air. Pottery jars lined market stalls beside folded linen cloth and baskets of vegetables. The smell of fish, smoke, sweat, spices, and baked bread mixed together beneath the growing sun. Yet even busy markets reflected continuity more than rapid transformation. Most goods were familiar. Most buyers already knew what they needed. Daily commerce centered on necessities rather than novelty. People bought what allowed life to continue smoothly. Not what might radically alter it. In one shaded workshop, a carpenter shaped wooden furniture using bronze tools laid out carefully beside him. Sawdust gathered around his feet while sunlight entered through a narrow opening high in the wall. His apprentice watched closely. The carpenter explained each cut slowly, emphasizing precision and patience. The apprentice repeated the motions again and again using scrap wood before being trusted with more important work. Learning was gradual. Mastery came through repetition. And because crafts required years to perfect, traditions remained remarkably stable over time. Even clothing changed slowly. Most ordinary Egyptians wore simple linen garments suited to the heat. Styles varied somewhat across periods and social classes, but basic forms remained recognizable for centuries. Comfort and practicality mattered more than constant fashion. The climate itself discouraged unnecessary complication. By midday, the familiar heaviness of heat settled across the land once more. Streets emptied slightly as people sought shade where they could find it. Dogs rested beneath carts. Laborers wiped sweat from tired faces. Inside homes, cooking fires burned steadily while women prepared the day's meal. Bread baked against clay ovens. Beer fermented slowly in jars stored along cool walls. Children slept through the hottest hours while older relatives sat quietly nearby. Outside, palm leaves barely moved in the still air. Time itself seemed slower beneath the heat. And perhaps this slowness also shaped Egypt's resistance to rapid change. Life unfolded according to rhythms set partly by climate, partly by the river, and partly by traditions so old they felt natural. Evening finally returned with gradual relief. The sunlight softened. Shadows lengthened. Workers left the fields carrying tools worn smooth by years of use. The smell of cooking fires drifted once again through the villages as families gathered outside their homes beneath the darkening sky. Old stories returned with the night. Stories repeated countless times before. Stories about gods guiding the sun across the heavens. Stories about wise rulers maintaining order. Stories about the Nile bringing life to the land. And while those stories moved softly through the warm evening air, the river continued flowing northward beneath the stars exactly as it had yesterday, and the day before, and the century before that. Steady. Patient. Endless. Before sunrise, the Nile Valley belonged to shadows and soft sounds. The river moved quietly through the darkness while thin bands of mist drifted low above the water. Reeds bent gently near the shore. Insects hummed in the cool air. Far across the fields, a single lantern flickered beside a narrow footpath where someone had already begun walking toward the day's labor. Most of Egypt still slept. Inside mud brick homes, families rested close together on woven mats spread across packed earth floors. The walls held traces of yesterday's warmth, though the night air had softened the heat enough to make sleep easier for a few brief hours. Then slowly, as always, the land began to wake. A rooster cried somewhere beyond the riverbank. A dog barked once in the distance. And in one village near a broad bend in the Nile, an old baker pushed open a wooden door and stepped outside into the pale darkness before dawn. His joints ached in the cool morning air. Years of lifting grain sacks and kneading dough had stiffened his hands. Yet his body already knew the rhythm of the coming hours. Gather the wood. Light the fire. Prepare the flour. Wait for the first customers. Nothing about the routine surprised him anymore. And that familiarity brought a quiet kind of peace. The baker crossed a small courtyard where baskets of grain rested beneath linen coverings. He knelt beside the clay oven and carefully stirred old ashes with a wooden stick until faint orange light returned from beneath the gray dust. Soon smoke rose slowly into the still air. The smell of burning reeds spread softly through the village. Nearby homes were awakening too now. A woman stepped outside carrying a water jar against her shoulder. Another crouched beside a grinding stone, already preparing grain while her children still slept inside. The sound of grinding grain slowly filled the dawn. A low scraping rhythm repeated again and again across the village. Stone against stone. Steady. Unchanging. Many sounds in ancient Egypt remained familiar across entire lifetimes. The sounds of sandals on dry earth. The splash of water jars filling at the Nile. The creak of wooden boats tied along the shore. The hammering of craftsmen beneath shaded workshop roofs. These repeated sounds shaped memory itself. A child growing old in Egypt carried the same daily noises through every stage of life. And because daily life changed slowly, memories often blended gently together across decades. The eastern horizon brightened little by little. Palm trees emerged from shadow. The river turned silver beneath the first traces of sunlight. And soon workers began moving through the village paths carrying tools toward the fields. Most farmers owned very little. A wooden hoe. A basket. A knife. Perhaps a few animals if fortune allowed it. Yet these simple tools were precious because survival depended on them completely. A broken tool could disrupt an entire season of labor. And so tools were repaired carefully, protected carefully, passed from parent to child. The same was true for knowledge itself. Near the fields, an older farmer walked beside a younger relative while explaining how to judge the moisture of the soil after irrigation. He scooped a small handful of earth into his palm and crumbled it slowly between rough fingers. The younger man listened closely. Nothing was written down. The lesson moved through speech, gesture, and repetition. This was how much of Egypt preserved itself. Not through sudden invention, but through careful continuation. As sunlight spread across the valley, the heat began returning to the land. Birds rose from marsh grasses beside irrigation canals while oxen moved slowly through the fields pulling wooden plows. The farmers worked in silence for long stretches. There was little need for constant conversation. Everyone already understood the task. Plant. Dig. Carry. Water. Repeat. Nearby, children chased birds away from fresh seed while trying to avoid the watchful eyes of older workers. Their laughter drifted briefly through the warm morning air before fading beneath the steady sounds of labor. For many Egyptian children, adulthood arrived gradually rather than suddenly. Responsibilities increased little by little. A child helping with simple chores eventually learned larger tasks. Years passed quietly this way until one day the child simply belonged fully to the working world. The transition felt natural because it followed familiar patterns already seen in parents and grandparents. In Egypt, the future often looked much like the past. Along the Nile itself, traffic slowly increased as morning advanced. Narrow boats carrying grain, pottery, vegetables, and reeds drifted northward with the current while others traveled south using sails lifted by favorable winds. Boatmen called softly to one another across the water. Paddles dipped rhythmically into the river. The smell of wet wood and fish lingered in the air. Though the Nile connected distant parts of Egypt, travel still remained slow enough that local traditions survived strongly in many communities. News moved carefully from place to place. Customs changed gradually. Villages preserved their own familiar habits across generations. This slowness protected continuity. A royal decree announced in one city might take considerable time to fully influence distant farming settlements. Even then, local routines often remained mostly unchanged beneath larger political shifts. Dynasties rose. Dynasties weakened. But ordinary labor continued. In crowded towns farther downstream, scribes sat beneath shaded porticos recording deliveries of grain and livestock into official storehouses. Their reed pens moved steadily across papyrus while laborers unloaded goods nearby. The scribes worked carefully because writing carried authority. A record once written could shape taxes, labor obligations, or legal disputes far into the future. Accuracy mattered. Tradition mattered too. Many scribes copied older forms and phrases exactly as they had been taught. Official language remained remarkably stable across long stretches of Egyptian history because institutions themselves valued continuity. Even handwriting styles changed slowly. A scribe trained decades earlier might still recognize the work of a younger scribe because both followed inherited conventions passed carefully from teacher to student. In this way, writing acted almost like memory preserved outside the human body. It allowed Egypt to hold onto itself. By midday, sunlight blazed across the valley with full intensity. White walls reflected sharp brightness into narrow streets. Dust rose beneath sandals and donkey hooves. Workers searched constantly for patches of shade where they could briefly rest their aching backs. The heat shaped daily schedules strongly. Many people paused during the hottest hours whenever possible. Conversations became quieter. Movements slowed. Even animals sought shelter beside walls or beneath woven coverings stretched between buildings. Inside homes, women prepared food while trying to keep younger children cool. Water jars stood in shaded corners. Bread rested beneath cloth coverings to protect it from insects and dust. The smell of onions cooking in oil drifted through the streets. Nearby, an elderly woman sat spinning flax fibers into thread while speaking softly to her granddaughter. Her hands moved with practiced ease despite her age. The girl watched carefully, imitating each motion. Again, knowledge passed slowly forward. Not through books. Not through schools for most people. But through patient observation repeated over many years. This method preserved stability because learning remained tied closely to existing traditions. Children inherited habits before they fully understood them. And habits are difficult to change once deeply rooted. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, cooler breezes finally returned from the river. Workers gathered tools and prepared to leave the fields. Fishermen repaired torn nets beside the shore while the western sky turned gold and amber above the palms. The villages gradually filled once more with the sounds of returning life. Footsteps. Low voices. Cooking fires crackling. Children calling to one another. The smell of bread baking rose warmly into the evening air. Families gathered outside homes to eat simple meals together beneath fading daylight. Clay cups passed from hand to hand. Older relatives spoke quietly about river levels, weather, taxes, and small village concerns. Many conversations sounded nearly identical to conversations held generations earlier. That sameness was not considered failure. It was reassurance. In a world where floods could fail, diseases could spread, and deserts always waited nearby, familiar routines created a sense of safety. Night slowly returned again. Stars emerged above the darkening river. Temple lamps flickered in the distance beyond the fields. And Egypt settled once more into its ancient rhythm of rest, repetition, and quiet continuity beneath the endless desert sky. The stars above the Nile Valley seemed almost close enough to touch in the deepest hours of night. They hung silently over the river, over the sleeping villages, over the long strips of farmland pressed carefully between desert and water. Their reflections trembled softly on the dark surface of the Nile where slow currents carried pieces of reeds downstream through the darkness. Most of the world was still. Only a few lamps remained lit. Only a few voices drifted through the night air. And beneath that enormous sky, ancient Egypt rested once again inside the same rhythms it had followed for generations beyond counting. In one small home near the edge of a larger town, a young mother sat awake beside her sleeping child. The boy's breathing rose and fell softly beneath a linen cloth while warm night air drifted through the open doorway. Nearby, a clay lamp flickered gently against the wall, throwing moving shadows across baskets, tools, and water jars lined carefully in their familiar places. The woman quietly repaired a torn piece of linen clothing by hand. Needle through cloth. Pull. Fold. Repeat. Outside, somewhere farther down the narrow street, another family was likely doing the same thing. Repairing. Mending. Preserving. Much of Egyptian life centered not on creating entirely new things, but on maintaining what already existed. Homes required constant care because mud bricks slowly cracked beneath years of heat and wind. Sandals wore thin against rough ground. Fishing nets tore. Clay jars chipped. Roof coverings loosened during storms. Everything needed attention. And so daily life became filled with acts of careful continuation. These habits shaped the broader culture too. A civilization built around maintenance naturally grows cautious about sudden change. People become skilled at preserving systems rather than replacing them. Along the Nile shore, a fisherman sleeping inside his boat stirred briefly as cool wind moved across the water. The smell of wet reeds and river mud surrounded him. Above, the moon cast pale light over tied boats resting side by side along the bank. Tomorrow before sunrise, the fishermen would wake again. They would untie ropes. Push boats into the river. Check their nets. Watch the currents. The motions would repeat so exactly that one morning often blended into another. Yet to the fisherman, this repetition did not necessarily feel empty. It felt dependable. The river continued. Therefore life continued. Far away in the desert hills west of the Nile, tombs rested silently beneath layers of stone and sand. Some belonged to kings and nobles. Others belonged to officials, craftsmen, scribes, or priests. Deep inside those tombs, painted scenes still showed the ordinary routines Egyptians hoped would continue forever after death. Servants baking bread. Farmers harvesting grain. Musicians playing beside banquets. Boats moving along the river. Even eternity was imagined through familiar activities. That alone reveals how deeply Egyptians valued continuity. They did not dream of escaping ordinary life completely. They dreamed of preserving its best parts forever. As night slowly moved toward dawn, the air cooled slightly across the valley. The desert released some of the heat stored during the day. Palm leaves whispered softly above dark irrigation canals. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, the eastern sky began to pale. Another day approached. In temple compounds across Egypt, priests were among the first to awaken. Sacred duties began before sunrise because maintaining divine order could not wait for daylight. Inside quiet chambers smelling of incense and old stone, temple servants relit lamps extinguished during the night. A young priest carried fresh water through a columned hall where painted stars covered the ceiling overhead. His bare footsteps echoed softly against smooth stone floors worn by countless earlier priests walking the same path. The temple itself felt outside ordinary time. Its walls held memories from many generations. Its rituals repeated endlessly. Even new rulers often added their own carvings beside older ones rather than destroying the past entirely. Egyptian kings frequently presented themselves as continuers of ancient traditions, not enemies of them. To preserve order was honorable. To maintain harmony was sacred. And so Egypt changed carefully, often absorbing new influences slowly into existing systems rather than replacing those systems outright. Outside the temples, villages awakened gradually beneath the soft growing light of dawn. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Women walked toward the river carrying jars balanced expertly against their shoulders. Dogs stretched lazily near doorways. The first sounds of grinding grain returned once more. Stone against stone. Slow and steady. A young girl sat beside her mother learning the proper rhythm for crushing grain into flour. The work was difficult for small arms. Her movements were uneven at first. The mother corrected her gently. Again. Slower. Use both hands. The lesson would continue for many mornings to come. Learning in Egypt often happened this way, not through sudden instruction, but through years of repetition beside older family members. Children absorbed routines almost without realizing it. By adulthood, many tasks felt as natural as breathing. This method preserved stability across generations. Customs survived because they lived inside bodies and habits, not only in written laws. As the sun rose higher, workers entered the fields while coolness still lingered faintly in the morning air. Irrigation channels glimmered beside dark fertile soil. Farmers walked slowly behind oxen pulling wooden plows that looked much like plows used centuries earlier. The tools evolved only gradually because older designs continued functioning well enough. In harsh environments, reliability often matters more than novelty. A farmer risking his family's survival on uncertain experiments could lose everything. But familiar methods offered some measure of security. And so Egypt remained patient. In one field, several laborers worked together lifting water from a canal using simple balancing devices made from wood and rope. The work required rhythm and coordination. Water splashed into channels feeding thirsty crops beneath the strengthening sun. Nearby, an older worker paused briefly and rubbed his shoulder before continuing again. Physical exhaustion shaped daily existence for most Egyptians. Bodies wore down slowly beneath years of repetitive labor. Backs stiffened. Hands roughened. Teeth cracked from coarse bread filled with bits of stone from grinding grain. Yet work continued. Day after day. Season after season. There was little choice. By mid-morning, the markets in larger towns had become crowded with merchants, laborers, servants, and travelers arriving by riverboat. The air smelled of fish, bread, sweat, spices, smoke, and animals. A merchant selling pottery arranged his vessels carefully in familiar patterns outside his stall. Most customers already knew what shapes and sizes they wanted because household needs changed very little across generations. Storage jars, water jars, cooking pots, oil lamps. The objects of daily life remained remarkably stable because daily life itself remained stable. Nearby, a scribe sat cross-legged beneath shade recording grain deliveries into a warehouse. His reed brush moved steadily across papyrus while workers carried heavy sacks behind him. The scribe's training connected him to centuries of administrative tradition. Forms, symbols, and accounting methods survived because scribes copied earlier records faithfully. Bureaucracy itself became another force preserving continuity. Writing fixed systems into place. And once systems become written, they often resist rapid change. At midday, heat spread heavily across Egypt once more. Sunlight shimmered above rooftops and roads. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads while searching constantly for brief patches of shade. Inside workshops, craftsmen continued repetitive tasks despite the heat. A stone carver chipped slowly at a block destined for a tomb wall. Nearby, an apprentice gathered fallen fragments from the floor. Tap. Pause. Brush away dust. Tap again. Even artistic labor moved with patience. Precision mattered more than speed. Outside, children slept through the hottest hours while older relatives rested nearby speaking softly about weather, harvests, and river conditions. Conversations drifted lazily through shaded courtyards. Life slowed beneath the afternoon heat. Then evening slowly approached again. The fierce brightness softened into warm gold across the fields. Workers began returning home carrying tools over tired shoulders. Fishermen prepared evening meals beside the shore while birds circled above the marshes searching for insects. The smell of bread baking returned once more to the villages. So did the low sounds of conversation. Families gathered outside homes beneath the cooling sky while children leaned sleepily against parents after long days beneath the sun. Above them all, the stars gradually emerged once again over the Nile Valley. The same stars. The same river. The same ancient rhythms continuing softly through the darkness. The Nile carried the night quietly through Egypt. Its slow dark water reflected thin strips of moonlight between the reeds while soft wind moved across the riverbanks. Boats rocked gently where they had been tied for the evening. Ropes creaked faintly against wooden posts driven deep into the mud. Beyond the river, fields rested beneath darkness, waiting for another sunrise and another day of labor. The villages had mostly fallen silent now. Only a few distant voices drifted through the warm air. A child murmured in sleep somewhere behind a mud brick wall. A dog barked once and then settled again. Near the edge of one village, a cooking fire still glowed faintly red while an old man sat beside it rubbing tired hands together slowly. His day had been long. Most days were. He had spent the morning repairing irrigation channels damaged during the previous flood season. The work required bending for hours beneath the sun while lifting wet earth with wooden tools. His shoulders still ached from the effort. Yet tomorrow he would return to the same canal. The same work. The same tools. This repetition was not unusual in Egypt. It was life itself. Many workers spent decades performing nearly identical tasks from sunrise to sunset. The repetition shaped muscles, habits, conversations, even thoughts. People learned to expect continuity because continuity surrounded them everywhere. In the stillness of night, the old man listened to insects singing near the water and thought about little beyond tomorrow's labor and whether the canal walls would hold properly this season. His concerns were practical. Immediate. Like most ordinary Egyptians, he did not imagine himself standing at the center of history. He simply lived within the rhythms handed down to him. And those rhythms were ancient already. Farther north, near a larger town where narrow streets wound between crowded homes and workshops, a group of laborers slept together on a flat rooftop beneath the open sky. The inside rooms below still trapped too much heat from the day, so many people preferred rooftops whenever the weather allowed it. The men slept on woven mats laid close together. Beside them rested their sandals, folded linen garments, and simple tools needed again at dawn. One laborer turned in his sleep, his arms sore from hauling stone blocks at a construction site beside the river. Dust still clung faintly to his skin despite washing before nightfall. Tiny cuts marked his hands where rough rope had rubbed against them throughout the day. The great monuments of Egypt often appear still and permanent now. But they were built slowly through endless ordinary labor. Sweat. Repetition. Heavy lifting. Day after day. Most workers never saw themselves creating wonders for distant ages. They saw only the next stone, the next load, the next aching sunrise. And because the systems organizing labor remained stable for so long, Egypt could sustain enormous projects across generations. Stability allowed patience. Patience allowed endurance. Near the center of town, a temple stood silent beneath the stars. Tall columns cast dark shadows across the courtyard while faint incense still lingered in the air from evening rituals. Inside, sacred objects rested behind closed doors where priests would return again before dawn. Temples embodied continuity more clearly than perhaps any other place in Egypt. Their rituals repeated endlessly. Their walls preserved old stories. Their architecture honored older forms. Even when repairs became necessary, builders often restored structures carefully rather than replacing them with entirely new designs. The sacred past remained alive inside the present. A young temple servant sleeping near a storage room would awaken soon, long before sunrise, to begin preparing offerings for the morning ceremonies. He already knew each step of the routine. Carry the water. Clean the floor. Prepare the bread. Light the lamps. His teachers had shown him patiently over many years. He would eventually teach another young servant the same way. Thus continuity survived not only through laws or kings, but through countless quiet acts of instruction repeated across generations. Outside the town walls, desert wind moved lightly across the sand. The dry hills beyond the Nile Valley remained silent and empty beneath moonlight. Tomb entrances hidden among the cliffs guarded chambers filled with painted scenes of daily life. Fishing. Hunting. Farming. Music. Feasting. Even in death, Egyptians surrounded themselves with images of continuity and routine. The afterlife was imagined not as chaos or radical transformation, but as peaceful continuation beside fertile fields and flowing water. This vision reflected what people valued most deeply. Not constant change, but enduring order. As the eastern horizon slowly began to pale once more, Egypt prepared to wake again. The river mist returned softly over the Nile. Birds stirred among the reeds. A faint coolness lingered in the air before the heat of another day. In a village farther south, a woman rose quietly from beside her sleeping family and stepped outside carrying a clay jar. Her feet moved automatically through the courtyard. She had followed this same path every morning for years. The packed earth felt familiar beneath her sandals. The water jar balanced naturally against her hip. Soon other women appeared along the same narrow path leading toward the riverbank. Some greeted each other softly. Others walked in silence, still heavy with sleep. The Nile greeted them with its usual smells. Wet mud. River plants. Fish. Cool water. Nearby, fishermen were already pushing boats away from shore while the sky remained gray-blue above the eastern horizon. One man checked the knots securing his net while another adjusted a small sail carefully patched many times before. Repair mattered constantly in Egypt because replacement was difficult and costly. Boats, clothing, tools, and homes all demanded steady maintenance. This encouraged carefulness. People learned to value preservation over waste. The same mentality often extended into social customs and institutions as well. Why abandon systems that still functioned? Why rush toward uncertainty? As sunlight slowly spread across the valley, workers entered the fields once again. Oxen moved through damp soil while farmers guided plows behind them. Irrigation channels reflected golden light between rows of growing crops. The work unfolded with quiet familiarity. A younger farmer paused beside an older relative who demonstrated how to clear mud from a canal opening properly without weakening the walls. Watch carefully. Use the tool this way. Not too deep. Again. Lessons moved slowly through observation and repetition. Many techniques survived for centuries precisely because they were embedded in everyday habits rather than abstract theory. In crowded market streets, merchants arranged goods beneath woven shades while scribes prepared writing materials beside official storehouses. Potters carried stacks of fresh vessels toward market stalls. Bakers removed warm loaves from clay ovens blackened by years of smoke. The smell of bread drifted through the morning air once more. It was one of the oldest smells in Egypt. Children chased each other briefly through the streets before older voices called them back toward chores and responsibilities. Even play often unfolded beside work. Young people learned adult routines gradually simply by living close to them every day. A boy helping carry water today might guide irrigation channels himself years later. A girl grinding grain beside her mother would eventually teach another child the same movements. Continuity lived inside ordinary family life. Not through grand declarations, but through repetition quiet enough to seem invisible. By midday, the familiar weight of heat settled heavily across the valley. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads and sought shade whenever possible. The bright sunlight reflected harshly from pale walls and dusty roads. Inside workshops, craftsmen continued steady labor beneath dim roofs where only narrow beams of light entered through high openings. A bronze worker hammered carefully at a tool head while sweat rolled slowly down his arms. Nearby, an apprentice watched in silence. The older craftsman repeated the demonstration several times. Again. 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 Skill required patience. And patience shaped Egypt itself. The civilization endured not because it constantly reinvented itself, but because it refined and preserved systems that already worked within the environment surrounding the Nile. The river flooded. The fields grew fertile. The people adapted to those cycles carefully. Then they held tightly to what helped them survive. As evening approached once more, the fierce brightness softened across the valley. Palm shadows stretched longer over irrigation canals. Workers returned home carrying tools polished smooth from years of use. Cooking fires flickered back to life. The smell of onions and bread filled the streets. Families gathered beneath the cooling sky while the Nile reflected the first emerging stars. And quietly, almost without noticing, Egypt settled once more into the same ancient rhythm that had carried it through countless generations already. Night returned to Egypt the way it always did, slowly, without urgency, as if the land itself needed time to release the heat of the day. The Nile reflected a sky filled with scattered stars. Their light broke gently across the water, drifting between reeds and floating shadows. Along the riverbanks, the last small movements of evening faded away until only the quiet rhythm of water remained. In the villages, doors were closed. Lamps dimmed. Families settled into sleep on mats laid close together inside mud brick homes that held the day's warmth like a slow memory. Outside, the desert waited beyond the fields, still and vast beneath the night sky. It never moved quickly. It never needed to. And beside it, the narrow green world of the Nile Valley continued its own long pattern of repetition. In a small farming village, a young boy lay awake for a little longer than the others in his home. He listened to the soft sounds of breathing around him. His mother nearby turned slightly in her sleep. His father had already fallen into deep rest after a full day in the fields. The boy stared toward the open doorway where night air drifted in. He had seen the river that morning. He would see it again tomorrow. To him, the world did not feel like something changing. It felt like something returning. This sense of return shaped much of Egyptian life. Each day came back. Each season came back. Each flood came back. Even the struggles of life felt familiar rather than new. Hunger was not unknown. Heat was not surprising. Labor was not unexpected. They were part of the cycle, as constant as the rising sun. Farther along the river, a small group of fishermen prepared quietly for the night's final maintenance of their nets. Even in darkness, their hands moved confidently through rope and fiber. One man hummed softly while working, not a song of performance, but something more like habit sound created simply to pass time while the hands continued their practiced work. Repair was never finished. It only paused. Every net would tear again. Every rope would weaken again. Every tool would need attention again. And so maintenance itself became part of life's rhythm, just like planting or harvesting. Across Egypt, homes and tools and buildings were constantly being tended, not replaced. This slow cycle of repair reinforced a way of thinking that favored stability over transformation. In a world where survival depended on fragile systems, the timing of floods, the fertility of soil, the strength of irrigation channels, abrupt change carried risk. And risk was something most people learned to avoid when possible. In a temple far from the village, priests moved silently through stone corridors lit by small lamps. The air inside remained cool, almost untouched by the heat of the day. The walls were covered with carved images of offerings, rituals, and ancient symbols repeated so often that they felt timeless. A priest stopped before a sealed chamber and placed his hand briefly against the stone. Not in hesitation. Not in doubt. But in routine. He had done this many times before. He would do it many times again. The rituals inside the temple did not shift with passing generations in the way other human practices might elsewhere. Instead, they accumulated like layers, each generation preserving what came before and adding only carefully measured adjustments. Change, when it came, had to pass through tradition first. It had to be accepted slowly, absorbed gently, and made to fit what already existed. Outside the temple, the night wind moved across empty courtyards. The stars above remained fixed in patterns that priests studied carefully. These patterns felt dependable, and so they became part of how Egyptians understood order itself. If the sky followed rules, then the earth should follow rules too. If the stars returned to the same places, then life should return to its familiar places as well. This sense of cosmic repetition influenced more than religion. It shaped how people thought about time itself. Time was not always seen as a straight line moving towards something entirely new. It often felt circular, like the flooding and retreating of the Nile. Rise. Fall. Return. Rise again. Before dawn, the river valley grew quiet in a deeper way than earlier in the night. Even insects seemed less active. Even wind felt lighter. This was the stillest moment, when the world seemed to hold its breath between one day and the next. A woman in a riverside village stepped outside just before the first hint of light returned. She carried an empty jar, her movements careful and practiced so as not to disturb those still sleeping. Her feet found the familiar path to the river without hesitation. She did not need to think about the route. She had walked it countless times. Soon others joined her along the same path, forming a quiet line of early travelers heading toward the water. The river received them calmly, as it always did. Jars filled. Water spilled gently over hands. Soft greetings passed between neighbors. These morning gatherings happened every day. They built community through repetition. Not through formal meetings or written agreements, but through shared routine. Nearby, fishermen pushed boats into the dim water, watching carefully for the direction of the current. The sky above them slowly shifted from deep gray to pale blue. Birds began to appear along the banks, moving through reeds in search of food stirred by human movement. The world was waking again. And it was waking in the same way it had always woken. Far inland, farmers entered their fields while the ground still held some of the night's coolness. Oxen pulled wooden plows through dark soil that had been enriched by past floods. The rhythm of work began once more. Step. Pull. Turn. Repeat. A younger worker followed behind an older man who adjusted the angle of a plow with quiet patience. No rush. No urgency. Only correction and continuation. Mistakes were not unusual, but they were corrected gently. Learning happened through repetition, not sudden instruction. Over time, the body learned what the mind did not need to constantly reconsider. In the towns, the markets began to fill again. Merchants arranged goods in familiar patterns. Bakers prepared ovens. Potters checked drying vessels. Scribes opened their writing materials beside storehouses where grain and goods were recorded with careful precision. Every transaction depended on trust built through consistency. Weights. Measures. Records. All carefully maintained so that nothing disrupted the expected order of exchange. Even small changes in systems of trade would ripple through daily life, so stability was preferred whenever possible. By mid-morning, he'd returned again to the land. The sun climbed higher, and the valley brightened until the river itself seemed almost silver-white in places. Movement slowed slightly beneath the growing warmth. Workers rested where they could. Animals stood still in shade. Children grew quiet during the hottest hours. In one shaded courtyard, a group of women sat together spinning flax into thread. Their hands moved continuously while their voices remained soft. Conversations drifted between topics that often returned to familiar concerns: weather, family, harvests, and the river. Nothing needed to be new to be meaningful. Repetition itself carried comfort. As the afternoon began to ease, shadows lengthened once more across the fields. The sound of returning footsteps filled the village paths. The smell of cooking fires rose again into the air. Bread baked. Water cooled. Families gathered. And the cycle continued. Always returning. Always repeating. And in that repetition, ancient Egypt remained steady for so long that change itself often moved quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of everyday life. Evening came again over the Nile Valley with the same gentle certainty it had always carried. The light softened first, turning the fields into long stretches of gold and shadow. Then the heat slowly loosened its grip on the land, as if the earth itself could finally exhale after holding the sun all day. Farmers walked home along familiar paths worn into the soil by countless footsteps before them. Their tools rested across their shoulders, heavy not only from use, but from years of repeating the same movements in the same fields. Nothing about the return felt new. It felt known. The river beside them moved in its steady way, catching the last light of day and holding it for a moment before letting it fade. Small boats drifted toward shore. Fishermen pulled nets from the water with practiced hands, their motion slow and careful even in tiredness. In the villages, smoke rose again from cooking fires. The smell of bread, grain, and warm oil spread through narrow streets between mud-brick homes. Children gathered near doorways, their energy returning as the day's labor eased. Voices grew a little louder now, no longer restrained by heat or exhaustion. Yet even in this return of life, there was still calmness. Egypt did not rush into its evenings. It settled into them. Inside one home, a man sat quietly beside a small storage chest made of worn wood. He opened it slowly, not because it was fragile, but because careful movement had become habit. Inside were simple items, a folded linen garment, a small tool, a worn amulet, and a few personal objects that had followed him through many seasons of work. Each item had been repaired more than once. Each item had lasted longer than expected. Nothing was thrown away quickly in this world. Objects were extended, reused, passed down, and preserved whenever possible. Even belongings carried a sense of continuity, as if resisting change alongside the people who owned them. Outside, the village slowly grew quieter again. Not completely silent, but softened. A donkey shifted in its enclosure. A dog settled against a warm wall. A distant voice called once and then faded. Above everything, the sky darkened once more, revealing stars that appeared in their familiar places, just as they always had. In a temple complex far from the village, priests completed evening offerings with the same calm precision that marked every part of their day. Lamps were adjusted. Incense was placed carefully. Sacred objects were returned to their resting places within the inner sanctuary. Every movement followed pattern. Every pattern followed tradition. And tradition stretched backward through time so far that it felt less like human creation and more like something discovered and preserved. A young priest paused briefly in a dim corridor after finishing his duties. He listened to the quiet of the temple. Stone walls held the soundlessness deeply, as if the building itself had learned how to remain still. He had been taught that order must be maintained constantly. Not created once. Maintained always. Outside, beyond the temple walls, the world continued its slow evening rhythm. The Nile reflected the sky again, darker now, almost blending into the night itself. Boats rested near the banks. Ropes tightened gently with the movement of water. Farther inland, in a farming settlement, an older woman sat beside a small fire grinding grain one final time before sleep. Her movements were slow but steady. She had done this task since she was young, and now she did it with a kind of quiet acceptance, as if the motion belonged as much to her life as breathing. Her granddaughter sat nearby watching, learning without instruction. Just watching. Just remembering. This was how most knowledge passed through Egypt. Not through interruption, but through presence. Children absorbed the rhythms of life simply by being near them. The repetition of daily labor became memory long before it became understanding. And so the cycle continued. Night deepened further. The village lights dimmed one by one. And the Nile carried everything forward in silence. Across generations, across dynasties, across centuries, the same pattern repeated: wake, work, repair, harvest, rest, return. Change did exist, but it moved like the river itself, slow, gradual, almost unnoticeable in a single lifetime. And because life remained so closely tied to the Nile's steady rhythm, Egypt learned to trust what endured more than what transformed. So as the final lamps went out and the land settled into deep night once again, nothing felt unfinished. Only continued. Only carried forward. Only quietly the same, beneath the endless sky and the patient river that never stopped moving, but never seemed to hurry either. Night in ancient Egypt did not feel empty. It felt full of quiet presence. The Nile continued to move through the darkness, carrying the soft reflections of stars along its surface. The riverbanks held still shapes of reeds and small anchored boats. Occasionally, a ripple spread outward where some unseen movement disturbed the water, then faded again into calm. The land itself seemed to breathe more slowly at this hour. In the villages, sleep had deepened. Most homes were dark now, their doorways closed, their interiors filled with the soft sounds of resting families. Only the occasional glow of an oil lamp remained visible through small openings in the walls, where someone might still be awake for a little longer before sleep finally came. Inside one such home, a man lay awake on his back, listening to the rhythm of night outside. He was not troubled. Just aware. His thoughts drifted gently through the familiar shape of his life. Tomorrow would begin like today. He would rise before the heat, walk toward the fields, and continue the work that had already shaped most of his days. There was comfort in that certainty. Not excitement. Not anticipation. Just recognition. Life, for most people in Egypt, did not arrive as sudden change. It arrived as continuation. Even aging itself felt gradual in this world. A person did not wake one morning feeling entirely different from the day before. Instead, strength faded slowly over years of repetition. Hands became rougher. Movements slower. Tasks more familiar than difficult. And so life was measured less in moments of change and more in seasons of return. Flood after flood. Harvest after harvest. Year after year. Far from the village, along a quieter stretch of river, a small group of boats remained tied together. Their owners slept nearby on the shore beneath simple coverings. The boats rocked gently, responding to currents too soft to be seen but still present beneath the surface. One rope creaked faintly in the wind. A fisherman stirred briefly in his sleep, then settled again. Even here, in the middle of night, work and rest were not entirely separate. The river never stopped influencing daily life. It shaped work during the day and shaped thought during the night. People who lived beside it learned its rhythm instinctively. It did not change quickly. And so neither did they. In a temple town farther upriver, stone structures rose in silhouette against the night sky. Their massive columns and walls seemed even larger in darkness, when detail faded and only shape remained. Within those walls, sacred fires still burned in controlled chambers, tended carefully by priests whose duties continued through all hours. Some rituals required constant attention. Others followed strict timing aligned with the movement of stars. The night sky was not simply decoration. It was a guide. Priests observed patterns above the earth and believed they reflected order below it. When stars returned to familiar positions, it reinforced the sense that time itself moved in repeating cycles rather than unpredictable lines. This belief strengthened the culture's patience. If the heavens repeated themselves, then the world beneath them could also remain stable. Inside one chamber, an older priest guided a younger one through a quiet ritual. His voice was low, almost blending with the sound of distant wind passing through stone corridors. "Not faster," he said gently. "Like before." The younger priest adjusted his movement, slowing his hands until they matched the established rhythm. There was no urgency. Only correctness. Only preservation. Outside the temple, the night air cooled slightly as dawn approached somewhere far beyond the horizon. The eastern sky had not yet changed, but the land itself seemed to sense the coming shift. In villages, early workers began to stir again before the light arrived. This early waking was not unusual. In Egypt, people often rose before sunrise to take advantage of the cooler hours of the day. A woman stepped quietly into a courtyard and reached for a water jar. A baker began to rekindle yesterday's fire. A farmer checked tools laid out near the doorway. These small beginnings repeated across thousands of homes along the river. And none of them felt new. They felt expected. The first faint light of dawn finally touched the edges of the sky, and with it came the soft return of movement across the land. Birds rose from the reeds. The river brightened. The field slowly emerged from shadow. Another day was arriving. But in Egypt, days rarely felt like beginnings. They felt like continuation. In one farming settlement, a group of laborers gathered near irrigation channels that had been used for generations. The channels themselves had been repaired many times, always in the same way, using methods passed down through experience rather than invention. A young worker knelt beside an older one as they cleared mud from a water opening. The older man demonstrated with quiet patience. "Like this," he said, guiding the younger hands. Not teaching something new, but reinforcing something already known. This was how systems endured. Through repetition. Through correction. Through memory embodied in action. By mid-morning, the fields were fully alive again with movement. Oxen pulled wooden plows through soil darkened by water. Farmers walked behind them in steady lines. Children moved through rows of crops chasing birds away from seeds. The sun climbed higher, and the familiar weight of heat began to settle across the valley. Still, no one seemed surprised by it. It had come yesterday. It would come tomorrow. And so it was accepted without resistance. In a town nearby, scribes worked inside shaded rooms where papyrus sheets were laid carefully across low tables. Ink was prepared slowly. Reed pens were sharpened and dipped with practiced precision. Each record they wrote connected present activity to older systems of accounting and governance. Grain distribution. Labor records. Taxation lists. Storage inventories. These documents ensured continuity across time. They allowed the system to remember itself. Without them, daily life would fragment. With them, it remained steady. As the day moved toward afternoon, the heat deepened again, and activity across the land slowed. People rested in shaded courtyards or beneath the narrow protection of walls. Even conversation softened under the weight of the sun. But beneath this pause, life continued in its quiet pattern. Waiting. Returning. Repeating. And as evening approached once more, the cycle prepared to turn again toward cooking fires, toward river paths, toward stars returning to their familiar places in the sky. The same rhythm. The same world. Carried forward gently, without urgency, through the endless continuity of the Nile. Evening settled over Egypt with a quietness that felt almost practiced. The heat of the day did not vanish all at once. It faded slowly, as if the land itself needed time to release what it had been holding since sunrise. Fields softened from harsh light into long shadows. The river darkened into deep bronze and then into black, reflecting only faint traces of the sky above. Along the Nile, small boats drifted back toward shore. Their movements were unhurried. Fishermen guided them in with hands that knew every current and every bend in the river. Nets hung heavy with the day's catch, and the smell of water, fish, and reeds followed them onto land. Nearby, children sat on the edge of irrigation canals, feet dangling just above the water. They watched the surface ripple gently as evening insects touched it and disappeared again. Their voices were quieter now, softened by fatigue from a full day of movement and heat. Behind them, women called them home. Not sharply. Not urgently. Just firmly, in voices that had been used for the same purpose for many years before. Inside homes, cooking fires were already burning again. Bread baking against clay oven walls filled the air with a warm, familiar smell. Pots of lentils and onions simmered slowly over small flames. Clay jars of water stood along shaded corners, cooled slightly by the fading temperature of the day. The evening meal in Egypt was rarely elaborate. It did not need to be. Food was meant to sustain the next day's labor, not to transform it. And so meals repeated much like everything else in life. Simple ingredients. Simple preparation. Simple rhythm. A man sat outside his home on a low stone step, watching the village return to its evening form. His hands rested on his knees, still marked by the day's work in the fields. Dust clung lightly to his skin. His shoulders remained heavy from lifting and bending beneath the sun. Yet there was a quietness in his posture now. A release. The work was finished for today. Tomorrow would carry it again. But tonight belonged to rest. Across the village, similar scenes unfolded. Families gathered in small groups outside doorways. Some ate together. Some spoke softly. Others simply sat in silence, letting the coolness of evening replace the weight of the day. Conversation moved slowly, often returning to familiar subjects. The river level. The condition of the fields. The strength of the sun. The health of animals. These were not topics of curiosity in the modern sense. They were matters of survival, repeated in every generation because they never stopped mattering. Farther away, near a bend in the river, a group of workers gathered around a small repair site where irrigation channels had been reinforced earlier in the day. Even in the evening light, a few of them continued checking the structure carefully. Not because something had gone wrong, but because maintenance was constant. In Egypt, systems were never considered finished. They were always being maintained. Always being preserved. Always being returned to a stable condition. An older worker placed his hand against the damp earth of the canal wall and nodded slightly. "Good," he said simply. And that was enough. Inside a temple complex nearby, lamps were being lit again as night approached. The stone corridors glowed softly in warm light that contrasted with the coolness of the evening air outside. Priests moved through these spaces in calm sequence, each step part of a long-established pattern. One priest adjusted a hanging lamp without breaking stride. Another passed silently carrying offerings prepared earlier in the day. No one hurried. There was no reason to. The temple did not belong to the moment. It belonged to continuity. To repetition across time. To the steady maintenance of order. Within the sanctuary, sacred objects rested in carefully arranged spaces. Their placement had meaning, and that meaning was preserved through exact repetition. Even small changes in positioning were avoided unless required by tradition itself. A young servant paused briefly near a carved wall and looked at the symbols there. He had seen them many times. They were not new. They were not surprising. But they were important precisely because they remained unchanged. Outside, the sky had fully turned to night again. Stars reappeared above the river in their familiar arrangements. The Nile reflected them softly, as if holding both earth and sky together in one continuous motion. In a distant farming settlement, an old woman sat near the doorway of her home grinding grain one final time before sleep. Her movements were slow but steady, shaped by decades of repetition. The stone beneath her hands had been used by her mother before her, and perhaps even by others before that. Nothing in her world existed alone. Everything had a history. Everything had been used before. Nearby, her granddaughter sat watching quietly, learning without instruction, absorbing rhythm without explanation. The sound of grinding stone became part of the night itself. Slow. Repetitive. Familiar. As midnight approached, the village grew quieter. Lamps dimmed one by one. Doors were closed. The sounds of movement faded into stillness. Only the river remained in constant motion. It carried water northward through the darkness, as it had always done. And along its banks, Egypt rested inside the same pattern that had shaped it for thousands of years. Wake. Work. Maintain. Return. Repeat. Not as interruption, but as life itself continuing forward without breaking its own familiar shape. And so the night held everything gently in place, as if the entire land was resting inside a rhythm too old to notice, but too steady to ever lose. The night over Egypt grows deeper now, not with sudden change, but with a slow fading, like breath settling into sleep. The Nile moves as it always has, quiet and patient, reflecting a sky filled with distant stars that seem unchanged no matter how many years pass beneath them. Along its banks, the last traces of village light disappear one by one. Homes become still. Fires turn to ash. Voices fade into the soft background of the wind. Nothing in this moment feels like an ending. Only continuation. In the farming villages, the tools are already set aside for tomorrow. A hoe leans against a wall in the same place it has rested for years. A woven basket sits near a doorway, ready to be filled again. Clay jars stand in familiar corners, waiting for water at dawn. Everything is arranged for return. Even rest is part of the cycle. Even silence is familiar. Farther away, temple walls rise in the darkness, holding their own steady rhythm. Inside, a final lamp is lowered. A priest moves slowly through a corridor one last time before sleep, his footsteps echoing gently against stone that has heard the same steps for generations. The rituals will continue tomorrow. And the day after. And long after that. Because they are not tied to one moment, but to the idea that order must always be maintained, gently and without pause. The river flows beside all of this, unchanged in its movement. It does not rush. It does not hesitate. It simply carries everything forward in a motion so constant it begins to feel like stillness itself. And in that movement, life in Egypt once found its rhythm. A rhythm of repetition. A rhythm of return. A rhythm where change was not absent, but quiet, so quiet it moved almost unnoticed beneath the surface of daily life. Now, in this final quiet hour, there is no need for further explanation. No need for detail. Only the sense that everything has found its place again, just as it always has. The fields will be worked again when the sun returns. The river will be walked again at dawn. The grain will be ground. The bread will be baked. The lamps will be lit. And the same world will gently continue forward, carrying its memory inside every repeated motion. As the last stars drift above the Nile, even they seem to hold still for a moment, as if listening to the silence below. And then, slowly the night becomes softer than words. The river keeps moving. The land keeps breathing. And everything settles into a peaceful stillness that feels like rest, like memory, like time itself folding gently inward. Until nothing remains except the quiet sense of a world that never truly ended, only continued.